Welcome, everyone. Today we have the honor here at the McCain Institute of welcoming not only our audience to a conversation about democracy in the Western Hemisphere, developments in the Western Hemisphere, but we welcome Ambassador Juan Carlos Pinzón Bueno. He is the former Minister of Defense and former ambassador from Colombia to the United States. You have extensive experience, Juan Carlos, if I may, working on international diplomacy and, of course, on relations among countries in the hemisphere and between the United States and Colombia. So I want to ask you about all of these topics. I think our audience is very interested in the Western Hemisphere, but also in global dynamics when it comes to democracy and liberal democracy in particular, whether we're on the rise, whether we can be optimistic, or should we be more pessimistic. So I think that is kind of the entrance point to the conversation. But before I get into a conversation with you about particular countries and the hemisphere, since we are at the McCain Institute, and you did have a relationship with the late Senator John McCain, our namesake, I wanted to ask you about that relationship and the impact that the senator had on you as a professional.
Well, Evelyn, first of all, thank you. It's an honor to be here. I'm very happy and as I said, very flattered to be at the McCain Institute, being next to you with your experience, with your background. For anyone who has followed you recently, you catch you at CNN or at Deutsche Welle or at one of these BBC programs, so it's really an honor for me just to be talking to you. About the McCain Institute, well, first, it's very impressive you have the leadership on this institute that is focused precisely on that, on leadership for democracy, for human rights, and for the important values that we share. And I think that's very important. And about Senator McCain that you mentioned, to me was very important. He was a person that, frankly speaking, inspired many people, certainly in the US, I'm sure, but definitely all along the world. He was a true leader. He was a man of strength, a man of values, a man of vision, but at the same time, a man of a big heart. And I think all that together represents what he brought to the history of the United States, but somehow to the relationship to the world. About Colombia, he was very important. In my country, he was one of the leaders for Plan Colombia, as President Biden was, and as President Clinton, as President Bush, and a whole set of leaders from the United States that even after then President Obama, President Trump, and today President Biden's continue to keep supporting my country
and
in
if I
different
can
ways.
interrupt, Plan Colombia, of course, was a plan that the United States and Colombia developed together in order to bring stability and security to Colombia, to fight the war against the coca, the drugs, and of course also to bring development to the country. Is that an accurate description?
Absolutely. Plan Colombia was a Colombian idea crafted here by leaders like Tom Pickering, who put it together from Ambassador Pickering. And from then, all along the whole interagency, the Department of Defense, Department of State, NSC, the USA funding, the Department of Justice, the different agencies that have been working on all this, and that has been very substantial. It allowed Colombia to really defeat terrorism as we know it in the worst part, affect the business of cocaine, and advance the country in development and in every metric, on security or on economic progress. I have to tell you, sad that probably we are in a reverse position more recently, but that's nothing to do with the importance of how it was crafted. And ending with Senator McCain, he was, vital for this. He was always supporting us behind on this. I remember being Minister of Defense, and he invited me to a conference. He was somehow one of the leaders at
the Halifax conference, right.
And I went to Canada, and it was very kind from him to invite me to this regional dialogue that at the end was a world dialogue on the future of democracy, security, and stability. And I think from then, he had clear that if peace does not come with strength and at the same time with development, it's not stable and sustainable, and then we repeat episodes of violence and crime. He was very clear on that about Colombia. You know, when we were in the middle of the peace negotiations, he mentioned that several times. And I think he's right in history. That's one of the chapters, you know, that later people will know more.
Yeah, yeah. Well, thank you for that. And I just found it really interesting that you had this personal connection to him, and you felt that as a minister, he sort of adopted you and said, let's go together to this conference. So that's wonderful.
He did.
I want to also talk about another country that he cared about deeply, which was Ukraine. And I bring up Ukraine because I think it's important for the audience to understand a little bit about what the war in Ukraine might mean, the significance to people in the Western Hemisphere, to leaders in Colombia and elsewhere in the Western Hemisphere. What from your perspective, is the significance and the impact of the war in Ukraine on your country and the region?
Well, the first thing that I should mention is that this is touching the tissue of democracy worldwide, and is touching the pockets of every citizen worldwide.
Right.
And those are the two main factors. On democracy and rule of law and somehow the world order, because it has proven that a country can make a decision to go against other and suddenly create a terrible disaster, not only in human lives in that part of the world, in destruction of the economic base for that country, but frankly speaking, threatening the values of world democracy. And I think that's something that every leader in every country, but every citizen in every country should be aware of. There are forces somehow of evil that can just go against the things that we believe are there forever, like freedom, like having access to vote, like having even access to basic services, water, sewerage, energy, and suddenly that can go away because of this kind of behavior. The second part is more direct effect into people's lives, and that is, in essence, the economic consequence of the war. The prices of commodities have gone up, so inflation is touching almost everybody in the planet, and certainly in Latin America. In my own country, Colombia, we have had the highest inflation rate in decades, but it is the same story in every country from Mexico to Argentina, crossing Brazil, Chile, etc. So it's very dramatic. Second, something that is very worrisome is the effect on fertilizers. Fertilizers were very much produced in that part of the world, in Ukraine and in Russia as well. Well, the scarcity of that is creating a challenge on food security. And that's something that we tend not to believe as a problem, but certainly has become a risk. And that risk is around. What can that imply? And thirdly, I think it's a step previous of the war, but it's also related to the role of Russia in the international arena, which was this intention or this behavior of trying to meddle into local elections. And we've seen that in Europe, in France, we've seen that in the US, but certainly it did happen in several countries of Latin America, including my own.
Can you talk about that?
Well, it's very worrisome. You know, the use of social media to create disinformation or to create well-funded campaigns that also interact with drug money or with criminal money in different countries. And suddenly those campaigns are used to take information that can manipulate part of the population. This is not a surprise. I'm not speaking on something theoretical or a big secret. It's something that already is being published on any media outlet these days. But it's very worrisome because that has been biasing, creating a bias in elections in different countries. So our systems are getting somehow rigged out of this behavior. The intentions are not to help those that are in need, those that are getting this information on how they're going to get solutions to their problems or to their intentions, but it's creating a divide in societies. It's creating a polarization. And in addition to that, it's trying to bring governments that can be manipulated with the intention of going against what we describe as the Western values, which again are so important for our freedom and for the beliefs that have allowed this part of the world to move forward.
Yeah, it is truly alarming to see what Putin's doing because he's trying to tear down the international order, all the rules, all the protections for human rights. Frankly, food security is part of that. And the use of disinformation to destabilize democracies is clearly an objective. So I would like to come back to this towards the end, in terms of what can we do as a collective, what can we do democracies in the Western Hemisphere together. But let me take a minute and dive into some specific scenarios in specific countries. And I want to start with Colombia because that is, of course, the country that you know best. Can you talk to us about the state of democracy in Colombia today and the state of the relationship between the U.S. and Colombia?
Well, I always that speak about Colombia want to be as responsible as I should. First of all, I think that my country needs to have a strong relationship with the United States, with the Western Hemisphere in general, and with Europe itself, with any country in the world, even with China. We need to sell products, we need to advance our economies, we need to do things for the benefit of the people that is in need in Colombia. There's poverty, there's inequality, but the solutions to those problems are precisely to thrive, to move forward the economy, to create better opportunities, not to destabilize the system or to shoot down part of the economy, as some of the ideas that are coming, just to shoot down once and for all the oil and gas industry instead of using it to fund a better future and more investments for a better energy to the future and more technologies and more educated people and better infrastructure and more security. The things that I've seen is basically trying to deteriorate what we had with no alternative of enhancement. And that's very worrisome. But as I said, I want to be careful because I want to see my country moving forward. And I wish the current authorities to understand that they can have a decision of doing the right thing. But if they continue to move on the path they're moving, I think that everybody is already seeing that. Colombia is starting to move a little bit backwards. And that, once it happens, can accelerate to the point of put a country in a difficult situation. I'll bring now the case of Venezuela. We can never forget. Venezuela was never a paradise when Chavez took over. No doubt. There was inequality, there was corruption, there was a lot of things that were worrisome. But at the same time, it was the country with the highest GDP per capita and the highest income in the region. So what was the idea for that time? Fix what is wrong and keep moving forward. So the quality of life and opportunity for people will get better. What did happen? The worst of all. They never solve any of the problems. Actually, those problems are worse than ever. They have more corruption than ever, more violence than ever, more deterioration in the institutions than ever. But the country fell down to the point that now is one of the worst managed economies in the whole planet. How can you do that? Well, I use that because we need to see that in a mirror. And we cannot allow a country like Colombia or any other to play that.
Are you saying you're afraid that Colombia could end up like Venezuela?
I'm afraid that we, instead of embracing people that is working hard and bringing jobs and opportunity, we start to embrace criminals, terrorists, or people that has really misbehaved in the name of giving solutions to the people. That will not give any solution to the people. People need solutions, but those are not. And that's what I'm trying to show, that yes, the narrative is the right one in the sense of let's work for the people, but let's do it in a way that we enhance our democracy, enhance our freedom, provide opportunities, education, infrastructure, technology, be patient because it takes time, reform the economy, at the same time move forward, instead of embracing everything that is wrong, because the only thing that will bring is a bad situation. And I think that's what I see in that mirror. Now, there's time to correct, and this is why I don't want to say this is the only thing that can happen to Colombia. No, I think it can happen very positive things. We have a very great opportunity and scenario, but I hope that the current authorities understand that that should be the path, not the other. Because the question is, which path are we moving? And there's suspicion that the wrong path can be a one that they choose.
Yeah. Well, we here in the U.S., of course, hope for a continued strong Colombia, strong democratic economic partner that we have been accustomed to having. You mentioned Venezuela, so I maybe will ask you now about Venezuela. What do you see as the dynamics there? Do you see this continued political malaise? Do you see any hope for change in Venezuela? And also, if I could add, what should we do? What should we do, Colombia, the United States, other countries?
Well, it's very worrisome what is going on in Venezuela, because instead of change of regime, what I perceive is that that regime is getting stronger than ever. And I think they are benefiting from what is going on worldwide. So the fact of what we described before, the war in Ukraine, has put them in the place of being asked for more oil.
Right.
But I think that just asking for the oil without a real change is, at the end, a bad deal for everyone, at least for the good people.
Right.
The good people of Venezuela that has fled that country in terror, being scared, being afraid of what can happen to them. For the good people of Venezuela that even might be, be accustomed to the regime but have no hope of an enhancement. And very bad for this idea that that regime has been hosting drug traffickers, criminals from the whole world, relations with Iran, a very strong connection with the Putin world, and around that, allowing even the Cuban regime to continue to exist using the resources of the Venezuelans. The question is, how can that be fixed and how that can be solved? And frankly speaking, by weakening those who are in the opposition, that's not a good solution. I mean, I think despite they have not getting to an agreement and as a joint unified bloc, it's better to support what they do, because at least those are people that are trying to speak for freedom and are trying to bring back the idea of democracy and the set of values of free market and all the things that we believe in. And
so you're saying, if I can interrupt for a second, so you're saying that the United States is not doing a good enough job supporting the opposition in Venezuela?
So, Evelyn, remember I still am an ambassador. That's
yes.
They said a title that doesn't go away. So I will not put on my word, an open, criticism to whatever is going on by the administration. But what I will tell you is that a lot of things should be done a lot better, and we should be not underestimating the consequences of allowing a regime that is full of crime in their hands, keeping their position, and even worse, weakening those who are fighting for freedom. I think we need to convene and work onto that, and knowing both the Democratic Party here and the Republican Party, that when they have worked bipartisan, like it happened in Colombia at the time of the McCain-Biden effort, I can tell you that those both share these values, and those are the real fights that need to be done beyond small things that can be around.
Well, and the reason, of course, that people are, as you mentioned, reaching out, or leaders are reaching out to Venezuela quietly, is of course because of their oil. However, it's not sufficient to really make that big of a difference when it comes to having to circumvent buying Russian oil. The Venezuelan oil, there's just not enough, and it's not the right kind to substitute. Let me ask you now, switching gears a little bit, but maybe I'm getting to even darker stories, because I want to ask you about Brazil. They had a January 6th, if you will, very recently, on the occasion of their change of power. So with the former Brazilian president leaving office and Lula da Silva coming back into office, there was an attack, again, similar to the attack that was conducted here in the United States on January 7th, 2 years ago now. There was an attack that was conducted in Brasilia on government buildings. In a way, it was worse because it appears that there was some military involvement. The current president, Lula, I believe he fired an army commander. So can you talk to us a little bit about what's happening in Brazil and the connection between what happened recently in Brazil and what happened in the United States, which of course was also election denial, fueled by the outgoing president, the losing president, who sent his people to the street, who funneled all kinds of disinformation through the media and at professionals in the government. In our case, not as much in the military, but in the judiciary, in the judicial system at the top, at least, attempts to try to get the Justice Department officials, mid-level or higher acting, to intervene. So in Brazil, it appears that something similar took place. Can you talk about the significance of that, and what does it mean going forward? Does this worry you? Do you think there'll be more attempts such as this, election denial and violence by outgoing presidents? What is your prognosis?
I would first start by reminding ourselves the importance of Brazil.
Mm-hmm.
Brazil is one of the greatest nations of Earth,
Yeah.
in Earth. It's a country full of natural resources. It's a huge country. It's a country of more than 150 million people. It's a powerful country. It's a great country. I admire Brazil. I think that that's one of the countries of the world that everybody somehow has an eye for.
Yeah.
And I
It's
think
like
that
the India of the Western Hemisphere, maybe.
it is amazing. It's an amazing
Yeah.
country. And despite Argentina, the world champion, they continue to be the country that has the five world champs still in
Okay,
football.
we'll
as
leave
we call it.
soccer out of this.
We
Or
call it football.
Football.
All right. But anyhow, I mention all this, of the greatness of this country, because it's very sad to see that a country such as Brazil is somehow in hands of options that are not to the level of the country.
Mm-hmm.
Either you have a very radical position that was perceived during the pandemic, anti-vaccine and all these things that I respect, but
Under President Bolsonaro.
right, it was in a corner. But on the other side, you have a president that comes from jail because of corruption.
Yeah.
And if that's the option that Brazil has, of course, is not to underestimate what can happen in the streets. There's a very big polarization around, and there's a lot of clash because of those streams or the voices, of course, that creates that kind of scenario. So I don't want to underestimate by no meaning whatever happened in Brazil. I mean, the fact of use of violence to take by force institutions is simply unacceptable.
Right.
And we have to have rules, and those rules need to be complied. And those who misbehave should be liable for their behavior. So they gotta go and serve justice. I believe in that. Here in America, or there in Brazil, or certainly in my own Colombia, or in any part of the world. Otherwise, if we don't respect rules, if we don't respect order, the only thing that we have is anarchy.
Mm-hmm.
And anarchy is precisely against the very basics of democracy and freedom. So I think that's the important fact. On the other hand, I think that what is happening right now is something to watch, because anyhow is now one extreme that holds power against the other extreme. So how these things are going to balance is something that still will be in question, and I believe that's something to be watched. Now, my final point on this issue is the bad example that has been set all around the world, and maybe this is part of the problem. On
Are
the
you
year we
looking at us?
Well, not only that, but let me give you one other example, Nicaragua.
Mm-hmm.
You have a guy that was using the democracy to get elected when he put in jail all his competitors.
Right.
And nothing happened to him. Nothing. And the reason is simple, because he has a Russian base, the only Russian base in the hemisphere, by the way, and suddenly he made the Chinese his best friend, putting away Taiwan. In consequence, who's going to touch him? As of now, nobody. So if they can do that in Nicaragua, if Maduro can do what he did in Venezuela and what he has done, the question mark for everybody else in the region is, okay, now is riots that you can use, now is violence, now is taking power, but whatever means you want. And in consequence, no consequence. I think that bad example is expanding. And if there's no clear rule of law to contain these kind of situations, we're in a very worrisome situation. Let me give you the case of my own country. We are probably the only center in the world that has war criminals sitting there with no consequence. And we haven't had peace yet. But that is a fact of life, that is happening. Or we have a case in which the party that is in government, before being a party, not only took the Supreme Court by force, but by violence under a terrorist action several years ago, decades ago. I'm just saying all this because we need to open our eyes. And if we want to have order, either in the right or either in the left, we need to understand that there are some rules that need to be respected, and that those who go away, they cannot go away with doing things like that.
So I understand you, and actually David Miliband, the head of the International Rescue Committee, has a recent article. Former British Prime Minister, yes, he has a recent article about impunity and versus accountability, and that the real crisis is not necessarily an erosion of liberal democracy. It's actually an erosion in accountability or in the rule of law. So you are actually sort of providing another argument for this, looking at it through the prism of the Western Hemisphere. But what do we do? I mean, how do we restore rule of law? Is it something that the United States should do? Is it, who can do this? Or does it just simply require vanquishing the best example of impunity, which is Vladimir Putin?
Well, I think it's a little bit of both.
Mm-hmm.
On the first hand, you need to prove that those who misbehave will have a real cause for that. And maybe you have to choose a case.
Okay.
And maybe you have to find a case that is feasible, but that everybody will know from the day one to the last day why exactly they are paying a consequence, and how destroying institutions, democracy, and setting an example is unacceptable. Because maybe that will be a deterrent for others,
right,
and others will kind of behave. Second is the use of the justice system, at least from the West and the international system, to really go against those that have been in corruption or that have been in criminal activities. Let me tell you, for a society, it's very hard to swallow to see that a guy that was, charged by corruption, or a guy that was charged for crimes against humanity, or a guy that was charged for a coup d'etat, suddenly they can be there and they actually do not get any consequence. Because that goes from the top down. And then society itself begins to ask, why cannot take a bike? Why can I not destroy this or that if the politicians, if the leaders, if the powerful can do whatever? So yes, having impunity is a problem, and being effective on taking cases and exposing those cases as events that are value change or somehow making a clear statement are very important. That's one thing. The second part, and most important in everything always, is culture and education.
Mm-hmm.
We need to go back and first look for education of quality. I'm going to tell you, in my own country, education, the funds we deliver for education in Latin America in general are being increased. But the question is where that money is really going, because it's not going into quality education, based on values, on activities that allow people to have an income, but very much are ideological perspectives that try to bias people into taking a stance or taking a position or blaming others instead of working hard. I think that, of course, this is a full political debate, but we need to focus on the quality of education. And thirdly is culture of freedom and democracy. Sometimes there are some that are taking the agenda of freedom by promoting a lot of things, but not because they really believe in the freedoms they are promoting, but because it's a way to handle power.
Right.
And once they get into power, they like to look more authoritarian than pro-freedom. And I think that was the case of Venezuela. That mandate was clear. So Chavez somehow represented the progressive liberal agenda, the idea of ending the bad things and opening for new good things. And suddenly he was misogynist, he was a radical, he somehow eliminated anyone who opposed to him, throw them away, put them in jail, and not even use the rule of law to protect people from his own colectivos.
Right.
And that's where we are today. So we need to watch those examples and, go against those events.
Yes, so the Hungarian Prime Minister, Viktor Orban, he came and gave a speech in Dallas, Texas last year to the one of the CPAC, the conservative conference. It's not even Republican, it's very far right conservatives. And he said, I'm bringing my recipe basically for how to take power and keep it. So, because what he did was, of course, like the examples you just gave, Maduro or Chavez or, I won't list all of them because some of them might be allies of ours, like the Hungarian Prime Minister, but you can come to power democratically, and then if rule of law and the civil society and the other institutions are not strong enough, and certainly if the person who comes to power then passes laws and takes action to weaken them, weaken the judiciary, weaken the media, weaken the parliaments, then you do have a system where you can be elected to power. You can have a demagogue that's elected to power, and they become a demagogue through all of their actions once they're elected. That is a real problem. I want to go back, though, to what you said about accountability and about addressing impunity, because there's impunity in these human rights violations that we see all around the world and in corruption. And I think it's very interesting, the point that you made, that you need to build cases and you need to have big cases to deter. And that is something we should really focus on. Obviously, the international community right now is very much focused on the Putin example because it's costing us so much money and it's so dangerous to so many people, and it's right on the border of the NATO alliance, so it could really unleash a global war, no joke, if it's not managed properly, which is what we're trying to do right now. But I also would agree, or if I could agree with you, I think that would be an example. If the Russian president were held accountable for his corruption, for his human rights abuses, that would be a step in the right direction. But I also think you are correct that in each region, every region has to see examples of that as well. So I think that's something for everyone in the audience to take away, to think about what could those cases be and how can we work together. And I think if you look at the Ukrainian example, there are many average Ukrainians who are collecting information using their cell phones. In India, fighting corruption, the average citizens showed, my government paid 3 times for a well, and there's still no well in my village. So I think there are ways that we can also use technology and this instant communication in a positive direction. So I guess I want to kind of leave that thought out there. But I don't want to go ahead.
Can I get a little bit onto your argument? Well, first, I think I fully concur to your thoughts. A few things I will add. First thing is, let's be aware today of the kind of disinformation that is going on. And one of the things that worries me is that these kind of, I'm going to speak for the case of my region, even my country.
Sure.
It's clear who has been in the drug trafficking business. It's clear who are the mafias, who's the FARC, who are the cartels,
right.
Who are the politicians that have been living out of them.
Right.
What that kind of a world does explain that everybody else is a criminal, and spread that idea to the point that to society, to a regular citizen, suddenly everybody is a criminal.
All politicians.
All politicians. One of the things that worried me the most was a number I just found in the Vanderbilt University study on the Latino barometer, and that found many numbers that are worrisome. But one that is really, to be concerned is that most of Latin Americans think that all politicians are corrupt. And the other one is that a very big chunk of Latin Americans think that democracy is not valuable anymore. And that's really terrible, because that's creating the opportunity and the space for those that out of populism, that out of selling small lines, just headlines, trying to push and benefit from that sentiment to lead countries into the abyss.
Right.
But it's not important for them. What matters to them is power.
Power, yeah.
Not better societies or solving problems. And that kind of competition is very difficult. So we need to watch that and expose that, because it is happening from the extremes, but they are, building upon that. On the cases, of course, the Putin case will be very useful to the world just because who he is and what the size he is.
Yeah.
But I want to be realistic. He has weapons that other doesn't have, so he can deter a lot of what can be done. But in this part of the world, we can do things specific to some of these dictators or to some of these new neo-populists that are trying to, destroy the institutions as we know it. And I think that's where I think smart approaches on using justice in an effective way for specific cases can really have an effect and a game changer.
Do you have a specific one in mind in the hemisphere as a priority for an example?
Well, there are several cases, but I continue to believe that at least there are 2 or 3 that are knowledgeable to everybody.
Okay, well, I'll let you off the hook. Let me switch gears slightly. As you know, in the hemisphere, well, really all over the world, of course, there are people struggling. Economic inequality has grown, unfortunately, and the result for the United States is, of course, an influx of refugees. In the Northern Triangle, we have economic inequality, we have insecurity, we have gangs, we have a whole host of factors that are contributing to people fleeing their country, not because they want to, but because they feel that they have no choice, that they must leave for the sake of their families. And they are coming at great risk to themselves and their children and everyone in their family themselves across to the United States over land. And the United States has said, okay, we're going to deal with the Northern Triangle countries, so Central America. We're going to help those countries that are interested in working with the United States address the seeds of the problem, so the economic challenges, the instability, the security challenges. Yet we still see this influx of refugees coming to the United States, and many of them have to be turned away because they maybe don't have the credible case. It's only economic, let's say. Only is tough to say. How do you assess our efforts so far? Do you think we've made progress in the last couple of years at all in addressing what's happening in the Northern Triangle, meaning the United States? And if so, what can we do to do better? If not, what can we do better?
Yeah. So first, let me tell you that we need to have a very humane attitude to those Latin Americans that come into the United States. And I have to express my solidarity to most of them. Mm-hmm. Most of them come here because they want a better future for their families. Right. Most of them come here because they want to have a job. And most of them are willing even to do things that nobody else is willing to. Right. Because they want to raise their kids in a better position.
They'll take jobs that many North Americans,
will not,
U.S. people won't.
Or would prefer not to.
Yes.
So let me embrace my Latin American fellows because they're hard workers and they're loving people and they're family people. They have family values. I do care for them. It's on my nature. On the other side, the big question is, do they come here because it's the greatest thing to come and take the risk that they take, and cross the Darien Gap and go up and confront the Mexican cartels and then confront the coyotes here at the border to get in and then get all the mistreatment and all the difficult life they get? I don't think they want to do that. They would prefer to stay in their own towns, having a life, having an income, and seeing their kids being raised. So that's the big question. How do we create that environment there? And I think
not that we don't want some immigration, because we do want some.
Of course, and
it's just the huge influx that we are incapable of managing.
I see the point, and from my side, I wish to see the youngster Latin Americans thriving in Latin America
Yeah.
and making, for instance, my Colombia
Yes.
more wealthy and getting a better position for all. But the question is, what kind of environment we need to work to get that? And we are at a confusing time because, if the argument is, well, everything is because it's inequality and poverty, so in consequence, those politicians that are now explaining that they were in inequality and poverty will solve the problem, is not true. Because what they are doing is populism, and that
Right.
populism is even bringing to more poverty, as it happened in Venezuela, where 6 million Venezuelans got
Right.
out of Venezuela. So that's not the solution.
Right.
What we need is to be strong and patient. Bring rule of law. Bring education in technology, bilingual skills, and certainly in activities that allow them to have jobs that are well paid. Thirdly, infrastructure. Latin America is missing of infrastructure, so they can, having a good human capital, to really dream about the famous nearshoring.
And you mean not just roads, but computer networks, etc.
Absolutely, the digital networks and also the physical infrastructure, both, because that will bring jobs, but at the same time increase the productivity.
Mhm.
And that productivity out of human capital, physical capital, and technology capital will allow the region to be more prone to take advantage of what is going on in Asia and with what we see in Europe. At the end, imagine the following. If the Western Hemisphere, from Canada to Argentina, were somehow planned in a way that we use everything we have, we will have 1 billion people. So we do not need consumers from other parts. We will have more water than any other part of the world. We will have more biodiversity than any region in the planet. We will have almost every mineral that is required, and we will have all the food that we need. But in addition to that, we have the United States, the greatest power in the history of humankind, especially with its own technology and knowledge. Imagine if someone were able to plan this and combine all this. It would be great for Latin Americans because we will get in a better position, enhance our incomes, get a better life, have these people really enjoying their lands, but at the same time, a lot of stability. And of course, I'm not saying we should forget about the rest of the world because it's there,
Right.
but frankly speaking, even for the sake of the US, will be even better. I will never criticize the efforts that are being done today in Ukraine by putting all that money because somehow they are trying to contain
Yes.
for the good of the world.
Yeah.
So I respect that and I see it. But sometimes I just do the accounting and I just think what would happen if that all money or part of that money will come to, let me think on my own Colombia, but let's say in Panama or Guatemala or El Salvador or Peru or any of the countries, Argentina, and getting all that money into education in digital infrastructure, in more and better airports, and in more rule of law and security, and in enhancing democracy, I think all that will result in a very prosperous region.
Do we do that through trade agreements, or how do we do, in an ideal world? I mean, without magic, how do you foresee that developing? More integration, economic integration.
So I go a step behind, and I think that it's critical to raise Latin America to a level of competitiveness,
Mm-hmm.
because otherwise it will not happen. And let me explain. The reason why even companies, despite all the risks that they have of being in China or in the Asian basin and all the potential risks to the future of major wars and things like that, continue to go to that part of the world is because of cost.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And cost is a reflection of productivity and how well organized you are to produce. In Latin America, still we continue to have too high costs,
Mm-hmm.
low productivity. How do we change that? And part of changing that is not just, okay, let me do a trade agreement by the sake of doing a trade agreement. How do we really change that? How do we really have more Latin Americans with digital skills? How do we have more Latin Americans speaking English so they can stay in their towns doing business
Mm-hmm.
with New York, but at the same time with Bombay or with London? Those are the kind of ideas that need to be game changers. And I think some of that needs to go into programs that are specific. I do believe, because I've seen it in the case of Colombia, some of the USA programs really have an impact. Sometimes their impact is limited to certain areas. I think if we go back to very ambitious people like President Eisenhower at the time, or President Kennedy with the Alliance for Progress, I believe that such kind of programs can be crafted. I'm hopeful that President Biden appointed Senator Dodd, and I hope he can go and think on these kind of major strategic programs that are for a generation. Those are not programs for a government or for a year or for President X or President Y. Those need to be programs for 20 years, but that suddenly can create a major impact. My final point on this is, in modern times of social media, we have fallen back into a very strange situation in which people believe that because you say it in social media, it has happened or is a fact of life will happen. And we have forgotten that the whole logic of management and making things happen is about allocating resources, capital, and time. Nothing happens because you just say it in a social media. Everything is bad. We should end poverty, and we should, make everybody wealthy enough. Nice statement.
Yesterday.
I mean, who will disagree with that?
Yeah.
Do it.
Yeah.
And that's the whole process. We have forgotten about that. So probably we need to go and educate more to people in this and be more realistic.
I agree wholeheartedly. More education, more economic development, but you were the Minister of Defense, so I don't want to end this conversation without taking a few minutes to consider what we can do for the security of the Western Hemisphere. What should we be focused on if we're taking the precious resources that we have and we want to support democracy? How can we best support democracy through the use of U.S. and regional military means?
I think it's a wonderful question, and I think we have three levels for discussion. The first one is the strategic global power competition conversation. I think the approach from the other powers, from the extra-regional powers to the region, is on one side to somehow make it more unstable, and that's the case of Russia.
Right.
They probably want to see regimes that are more difficult, that are against democracy, and somehow they like to promote that through the tools that we discussed before. That's one approach. So that we need to somehow insulate the region. We need to protect the region from those kinds of attacks and getting what we have now. The other side is more the long-term China vision, in which China probably sees Latin America from three different perspectives. One is natural resources.
Yeah.
So they are in that world and they really see that as an opportunity, both minerals and food. Second, consumers.
Mm-hmm.
They see here people that will take their products. And thirdly, power, which I think is a more long-term in the competition with the US. But of course, if they are effective in point 1 and point 2, they will raise to point 3.
Yeah.
And you need to see how you handle that. This kind of problem needs to be confronted by effective policies that enhance the quality of life and opportunity of Latin Americans. And the partnership with the US, not only at the leaders level, but at the citizens level, that they feel that, that's where opportunity is. So I think that's an important issue. The second level is more on the military means of what is going on in the region. And I think we need to make sure that the region continues to be free of many of the things that we were free during Cold War. Free of nuclear weapons, that's very important, and free of bases that are trying to create a problem of security or being used to destabilize the region.
Right.
That's the kind of thing we need to make sure never happens. Now, there are new kinds of technologies that are more complicated than just a base. And that typically is everything that can be done cyber. So that's an area we will need to work together in a way that we can make sure that the region is not taken through those channels. Because that's the most difficult thing these days.
Right.
So you don't need any more base to control a region. You probably need a very effective cyber capabilities that allow you to be on the offense, be on the defense, and somehow manipulate. That's the other thing that I believe is critical on that level. The third level is the more local Latin American challenge, which is criminal economies.
Right.
Criminality is taking over from Mexico to Argentina. And this is very sad to see. In Mexico, the cartels really taking a role in politics. In the whole Central American countries, we perceive that perspective of criminal money and criminal activity being around. In Colombia, it's very sad for me to say that we defeat the greatest threat, which was the FARC and all the terror, and suddenly bad decisions allow them to expand on cocaine, and now cocaine somehow is again taking a role in Colombian politics and in the Colombian decision making. It's very sad, but that's going on. And countries that were a little bit less affected by that, like Peru, Chile, even Ecuador. Ecuador is becoming very dangerous now. Brazil, that money is flowing. And unfortunately, that money is connected to the global power competition because somehow other players like Iran and others, benefit from those cross games that are going on. I think on that, we need to be clear and be very strong against that. There's a major debate on consumption. Should consumption be free or not on drugs, hard drugs, soft drugs, whatever? The only thing that I can tell you is that if that money continues to fund corruption, criminality, terrorism, and violence, Latin America will become more and more unstable on the benefit of those powers that are exactly seeking for that with no major effort. Right. And the worst of all, if that happens, the opportunity for a regular citizen in Latin America, for that family that should stay there because they can have a better life there than coming here, will be very risky, and they will prefer to continue to flow and move because there's no security. If they stay in an area, one of these regions, they will have to convey or be subordinate to the criminal gang or criminal leader, put the name you want on that area. Or the case of Venezuela, in which the state now is the crime, so it's even worrisome. So I think it's hard to discuss on these issues, but I believe those are the kind of discussions we really need to be thinking of.
Well, we're almost out of time. I want to go back to where we started. You are a leader in your country. You have held political position before. You know what leadership looks like. Of course, we have John McCain as an example. What do you think it is that leaders need today to fight the current challenges that we face in the Western Hemisphere?
I think it's a matter to keep thinking. I have to tell you, we are not with simplistic answers. I wish to have just these three ideas that will solve everything. I think we are in a complex scenario, and I believe that people that wants to have leadership these days need to sit and understand the complexity and all the channels that are interrelated into the current situation. However, there are three things that I continue to believe are important always. First, the love for your country.
Right.
You gotta love your country, and you gotta feel ready to take the cost of servicing whenever is necessary for the good of the country. Second, preparing yourself for producing solutions. Mm-hmm. Every time you go to government, you have a very limited time frame. The expectations are in the sky, and your capabilities usually are very below ground. How do you match that?
Right.
And how do you make really something that is useful, not for your satisfaction, but as a consequence to your people, and really moving the ball forward, getting the country, the people, those who you serve, in a better position. So you need to prepare, you need to study, you need to get ready. And thirdly, I think is the understanding of current times. Mm-hmm. We like to think sometimes as leadership from the eyes of those in Second World War, or even before. Yeah. These are other times.
Yeah. Winston Churchill wouldn't understand the modern
Well, I think he was so brilliant.
In some dynamic he would.
Probably if he would come, he would understand better than anyone, But our times are our times, and this reality of social media, the way technology is not only affecting what people get as information, but how they think. This events that are going to happen through gaming and metaverse and all that is happening. It's not theoretical. Those who are mastering those realities are taking over the will and somehow controlling, influencing, not to say manipulating, a big chunk of the population. We need to be ready to understand that. And even more important, how to take that not only away but to the other side and make those same tools for the benefit of growth, economic prosperity, and dreams of the new generation. That's the kind of thing or thought we need to put together.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Ambassador Pinzón. Juan Carlos, we hope that you come back again. Of course, you are part of the ASU family right now as a professor of practice. I hope everyone was listening. He was telling us that if you want to be a leader, you must care deeply about your country. Another way that Senator McCain would put it is service above self. So you serve before you care about yourself, whether it's in your community or for your country. Come up with solutions and then understand the current reality. So this was very helpful. Thank you so much for taking time to speak with us today. Thank you to our audience. Please go to our website, McCainInstitute.org, to follow everything that we're doing and conversations such as this one. Thanks very much.